I won this Parkzone P-47D Thunderbolt at a fun fly at our club's field, and it turned out to be a nice flying little airplane. As is the norm with these foamy ARFs these days, packaging is pretty well figured out. The P-47 arrived in perfect condition and had all the parts it was supposed to have. I make a habit out of checking the motor whenever I buy an airplane like this, and this one surprised me a little bit. All the fasteners were tight and all of that was fine. The holy cow moment came when I noticed that the thrust line is aimed out in right field someplace. But it must be right for the airplane because this thing flies very nice. And the way manufacturing is these days, they built those angles right into the mounts so it couldn't be gotten wrong at the factory, or you can't get it wrong if you have to replace something. I had to assemble a horizontal stabilizer that comes in two pieces with a carbon fiber reinforcement rod between them. And these parts fit fine, there's no trimming needed. The horizontal stabilizer is held in place with tape that goes on its fairing. I know it doesn't look very solid, but these things never moved the whole time I had this plane, and I hammered it around pretty good to see what it'd do. I did have to hook up the elevator clevis and was happy to see the piece of fuel line on there to make sure it stays secure. Later I found out that they had this adjusted almost perfectly from the factory. Here you can see the saddle that captures the wing, and each aileron has its own servo, and I started wondering about how I was going to get these wires down through this hole and put the wing on all at the same time. I cheated and looked at the instructions, and they showed the Y harness that once you put this on, you can feed that down through the hole into the fuselage, and putting this together is a whole lot easier. With the extension in place, there's plenty of length to push it through the hole and set the wing into place in its saddle. This really was the first time I set the wing into the saddle, and it fit pretty well. We didn't have to trim anything or do any fitting. And the screws that hold it in place went in without a hitch. I've had a foamy where we had to kind of hunt around with the screws a little bit to find their bosses in the airframe, but these went right in. You can actually get retracts for this plane, but I didn't want to add any extra weight, and plus I had fixed gear in my hands, so that's the way we went. The gear pop right into their holders in the wings, and then there's a plastic cap that you screw on over the top. This little cap just keeps the wheels from falling out of the wing. All the strength is in the mount of the wing itself. And here's where I realized that there's a left and a right gear. When you look at this from the front, you can see that it's way towed out. So I put the other gear in this hole, and it lined up perfectly with the fuselage. I'll bet it says something about that in the instructions. They also give you some fake gear doors to dress the struts up a little bit, and those just snap on, and yes, there's a left and right to those too, this time I looked. And there you have it. It's all together and ready to go flying, sort of. Still had to put the receiver in it and bind that, and we got to check the CG. I had this 6-channel receiver sitting around, so I used Velcro to install that and bound it up to the radio, and all that went fine. And I went through and checked all the control surfaces, make sure they're moving in the right direction, and set all of the limits. And here's my fancy test script where I do all the taxi tests with my new airplanes and make sure that they're turning in the direction I want them to. I wanted to take the time to point this out, that they do show the center of gravity in the instruction manuals. I keep having planes show up at the field that nobody's ever checked this. And that's a good way to crash an airplane. Because this is a low-wing plane, we check the CG with it upside down. And here on my CG machine, you can see that it stays nice and level. And here's where we see if I got everything right. And it's up and away and not flying badly at all. It needed a few clicks of trim, but that's all it took to get it flying nicely. Trim flight or not, I won't have a plane that won't fly inverted, and this one does it pretty well. There's not much elevator needed to hold it there. Towards the end of the flight, I started shooting some approaches, and it's not bad at all. But you do have to hold some elevator to keep it from flipping over. This isn't a real aerobatic plane, but it'll do all the basic stuff. And it came in and landed nicely, so our trim flight went well. If you want to add a warbird to your hangar on a budget, this P-47D is not a bad little plane. It flies quicker than I thought, and it handles nice in the air, and it even handles some wind without too much trouble.